Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. In every episode, we will discuss some facet of how RPGs function as modern myths, providing a shared canvas for creativity and the collaborative discovery of new worlds. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about player spotlighting, which I guess we should probably define it first. So at least, obviously put in your own ideas about this, but the way I look at it is the easiest way to break it up is between when people in a group naturally sort of step forward, my character says this, my character does this, versus when the system sort of dictates whose character kind of has the spotlight at a given point in time in the narrative. Do you both look at it that way? Is that a good way to move forward with the definition? Or?
Yeah, and I guess there's a little bit of when is a player speaking, right? Yes, we all have we all have things that we include, but at what point in time are we focusing on the actions of one character?
Right.
We kind of have to do that naturally, right? Because this almost feels like a paper tiger, right? Like something like, why are we talking about this? Because we are not naturally good multitasking creatures.
Right. At the same time, obviously.
Right. We can't tell a cohesive story if we're all just
And then that's the point. Really, is like whether the default is that it's kind of something that's arbitrated sort of naturally by our conversational patterns. But there are can be a lot of issues with that, including you have one player who's very vocal and you have one player who doesn't talk a lot. And that might not even necessarily reflect their characters, so that can be one way to sort of have the system be able to arbitrate a little bit.
Right. So we're basically going to look at when players make those decisions, right? When GMs make those decisions, which is, I think, kind of the de facto,
right?
Or
at least the fallback.
The fallback, right? That's true. Yeah. And then when system does, and I think we're going to be a little surprised by that because I think there are some mechanics out there that do it implicitly without doing it explicitly, and then there's some games that do it very explicitly,
right? Which
we'll talk about.
Sure. Yeah, and also it's almost like a way of looking at who's pitching and who's batting kind of thing, where it's like. If a character, a player, I should say, has the spotlight, it doesn't mean none of the other characters have any role in that scene. It's just their scene necessarily. It's more like they're sort of the one who's controlling sort of the direction the narrative's starting in.
And I also think from my perspective as coming primarily as a GM, I think, you're always aware of the person sitting at the table who's a little bit quieter, who may be stuck on the ship while everybody else is venturing around on the planet side, to be aware to include them or encourage them to kind of speak to their character and speak in the voice of their character.
Yeah, and this has been the source of memes in the gaming, particularly D&D world, is don't split the party, right? Because a lot of GMs don't want to have to balance that, right?
Although I will get to that. I've seen that very much work.
Sure, 100%.
Give an example of that. But,
yeah.
With splitting the party, right? It can definitely fragment focus and also be a problem sort of within the game in terms of the power of the characters, especially in a game like D&D where action economy is a big thing and you have 3 characters fighting in a fight. It's a totally different outcome than if you have 6. However, I have played in some games, actually even D20 style games, where splitting the party became very cinematic. And it was very, what do you do? Okay, these people are doing this thing over here. Now, over here, what are you doing? And it's sort of this back and forth cutting between A and B, and then they dovetail together at the end. And the last game I played with that was a space game, sci-fi, which it really felt like, we're storming the ship, we're opposite side of the ship, and what's happening, and hear some noises going on over there, and that's our buddies, are they okay, and then so it was cool.
Yeah, I have actually a really good story involved in that I had one character who was kind of a guy in the chair kind of character. This was in a modern sort of supernatural horror kind of game. Mm-hmm. And the main plot had to do with this with this sort of Kabbalistic society that they were engaging with and, like discovering problems with and blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
And the party was realizing that one of the people that they had met was ostensibly a golem. And over the comms, talking to the guy in the chair, they heard like a squishing sound.
Oh.
And then they called out the character's name, and the player didn't say anything. So it was like,
Yeah, so it can be a dramatic device. So it's not a hard rule of like don't split the party.
No, it shouldn't be. I think that's what we're talking about is how can you do it, and how do certain games do it that make that equitable?
Right.
Well, I mean, as Jamie was saying, I think that one of the key components to the game is when you're splitting the party, it should be an important split. It should have tension to it. It's not just, somebody wandered off there, or somebody wandered off there, and we're just lollygagging the story. I think it has to be connected to a reason, and then they have to get back together,
That's really interesting. That's a good question. So, because there have been a lot of games that I've run where sometimes there is no actual group. And in fact, there are some games that have to do with the idea that it's not a group.
Right.
Right? I'm curious what you guys think. Obviously, we play a social game, right? Like we're in a social environment. Having a table of 4+ people is pretty normal, very normalized. But so I think naturally the idea of a party.
Yeah, like I'm very fond of that kind of. I play games where there aren't that, but it's like the exception to the rule rather than, even most shows I like are very much like about a group of people who are together for some reason, and it's their story kind of thing.
Yeah.
Even if it's like a joke sort of thing, where like I don't think of the show Community. But,
yes. I was going to mention
there's like an episode where like they kind of like show it from other people's perspective, where it's like everyone else like, who are these weird people who are always taking the room, and like from that group's perspective, it's like we're the most important people on campus. This is our community. Everyone else is like, there's weird people, I like that sort of dichotomy. But
but like there are games like Vampire where here are these loners. It actually becomes a little jarring sometimes to like mash these characters, together.
I guess though, from my frames, when I'm thinking about it, like I'm thinking of like Star Wars, or you have like them in the New Hope, where Luke and Leia get siphoned off one direction, and then you have them reuniting, and of course there's C-3PO and R2-D2. That reuniting moment is this.
Sure, that's
we're back in the group, and everybody's had this intense experience, and can quote tell their story, which of course you've been watching from in a meta sense of the word unfold. But I always enjoy that return and everybody getting back together.
I mean, I think that's like a specific example of the sort of like break the status quo and then return to the status quo sort of format that comes up in a lot of games and shows and books, and where you establish it and then you break it, but then you want to get back to that place, even if when you get back to it, something has changed. You lost a team member, something happens,
But I think we all understand that the big problem ends up being players just sitting around twiddling their thumbs.
Sure. Yes.
Right? Like, do you guys feel that, or did you feel in any way a shift in the idea of splitting the party or player focus? Did you feel a shift when certain kinds of books came out and became popularized, like Game of Thrones, where you have individual chapters, right? And obviously Martin's not the only person who's done this, but I certainly saw more of that in fiction as after Game of Thrones. And of course, more people have read Game of Thrones now.
And he does it in an interesting way, and actually that might be relevant to this, where it's like his point of view characters, they're still called point of view characters, but it's not like, at least if I remember correctly, like having read them, like it's not like it's actually in their head, like super point of view. It's more like the story is around that character for this chapter, and that's kind of, I think that's a good way of looking actually at player spotlight, and for the character.
And it doesn't mean that there's not crossover. It's just this is kind of the protagonist for this
scene usually.
Yeah.
I think where I wouldn't say necessarily have experienced that in my gaming. What I think is the details of the worlds around my characters have gotten more depth. So in Cymberoom, for example, the understanding what's taking place with the Scarred Queen, I forgot exactly her name at this point, that has more relevance. There's a deeper story. There's more intrigue involved there. Does it impact the characters? It may. They know it as you're going through that world, but but it's not necessarily something that impacted my game directly.
Right.
But I do think the richness, the texture of those environments has definitely the world building out. It's not the cutouts of the original D&D that you saw in the D&D basic game. It's just so much more textured.
So we'll get into some specific systems that actually do this, kind of like within the system. But I wanted to ask if you see a difference between putting the player spotlight and the character. Like, is there ever situations where, it's like there's a either push and pull there, or so on. Like, because I know, like I was saying, sometimes you might have a character being played by a player who's kind of the opposite, where their character is very maybe their character is really avoidant of other people and like very quiet, but the player is the opposite, that sort of thing, and you're spotlighting them. Does that shift the character at all?
Well, I would say in the circumstances that I find that most often occurs is when you're playing with younger players, particularly like the teenagers, younger teenagers, quieter teenagers, where they want to play a more present, more proactive character, but they may themselves be quieter by nature, and so trying to encourage them and trying to support them, fulfill their vision.
Yeah,
and that my vision of the character.
That can be a fine kind of line to walk too, because if they're kind of feel put on the spot, like being put in the spotlight, like, because I've seen that happen before. I've experienced it sometimes where it's like you don't necessarily have something kind of like in mind of like where you want to go with your character in that scene, and something gets on you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you come up with your best ideas there, but sometimes you don't.
and then like you said, sometimes they're playing in front of people that they don't necessarily know.
Right.
So, you're trying to balance it and give them the space they need to enjoy the experience. And if they can't always be in character, that's okay too, as long as everybody at the table is still having fun.
Yeah, I definitely had a gaming group where everybody was really on point and very much participating and like really driving story forward. And then it was definitely a game. It was actually we were playing Primetime Adventures, and we were playing kind of like it was actually a lot like City of Mist in that it was a modern superhero series where the characters were based on myth, their powers. And whenever we would everybody would just give so much to what's going on. And then just had this one player who would just be like, we were just trying to pull stuff out of him. And it's and at times I had to set and make certain that's an out of game kind of conversation of, are you having fun? Is this what you want? Is it too much? Is it too little? But it can be kind of frustrating for everybody else at the table, who do feel like they're putting their all and do have a lot to put into it. And then you have one person's like, I hit them.
Right. And I mean, if they know about themselves and the other players do, and their characters fit into that can still kind of work. Like I've played in some groups where it's like there's one character who's kind of playing, stereotypically, the barbarian, where it's like that's kind of the character is that I hit him. And if anything, the dynamic is like trying to keep them from doing that, except for when you want to let them out of the, out of the staple and actually hit them.
We have those players.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But so it can be, I think that's one way that player and character kind of can be, but if they don't line up, then it can be a problem. Yeah.
I think where we we've seen that recently has been in this concept of kind of winning. So there's a lot of games out there who take on this perspective of you're using your whatever your best skill is, right? We were talking about Fate, where if you have an engineer, that engineer fights with a wrench and hits people with their engineer skill. You know, it's not about simulationism. It's about this person's being an engineer, right?
Or coming up with a story for it. Like if you're playing, the Naomi Nagata version, you use the elevator to come down the shaft and hit them.
Right, exactly. But and so there's this interesting story idea, or this interesting mechanical idea, where in a more traditional setting, people are doing what they're good at, right? And then a GM sometimes will put into a game a skill set that is completely outside the realm of what the players are really engaged in, right? If you have a bunch of murder hobos, the last thing they want to do is sit around and tell stories about courtly intrigue, you know? But there's a lot of GMs who feel like it should be balanced, or maybe they're running something that pre-published adventure, right? And that courtly intrigue is part of the game. And so now your players are forced to play outside the box, their own little box.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that sometimes, I think that sometimes the unexpected ends up being the most interesting thing about it. Like, if you're a murder hobo and you're going to run around and murder things, at a certain point, it's fun and all that other stuff, but it can be a little, when you throw in some wrench, they're like, what? And they have to figure their way through a different unanticipated scenario that adds a real element of intrigue and excitement,
which their characters aren't adapted to. And that's a big part of it. I think is like, I've experienced this even myself sometimes with new games where I haven't really got the system down yet, where it's like your character's put in a situation where their skills aren't matched to it, and you kind of see yourself looking at the sheet being like, well, what can I do?
Yeah.
As opposed to like being in the story, like what does my character do in that, and and I feel like I'm pretty narrative and story oriented, but I still catch myself doing that when I'm focused on the system. Sometimes I'll kind of like get too stuck on the sort of like, well, what's on my sheet? I can't take any actions. I can't do anything.
Right.
I think that's really important to note. Go ahead, Mark.
No. I just wanted to second what he's saying, though. It's sort of like if you have a bunch of murder hobos and they're, going down the Mary Lane murdering everything. When you run into that army on the other side of the hill, that's way bigger than they are, and the odds are now against them. That's when the game to me gets interesting.
And you need to think outside the box.
And now they have to think outside the box.
It reminds me of a great episode in the Firefly series called The Shindig, where you realize, because these are characters who are basically out in the expanse of space, how socially awkward most of them are, right? that they're just not used to polite society, of idea, other than one. But I think this is an important thing to sort of point out, how critical system really is. Like, I think a lot of people are like, well, I want a set of rules that are going to be out of the way, right? That I don't have to engage with. But are a lot of people who are sort of taking their cues from that system. And so you have systems that are very, very complex that will drive story in a prescribed way. But then you have systems that are a little very loosey-goosey or very undefined, and that's going to have an effect as well. And when you have games that have a little bit more to them, you definitely get that sense of looking at the character sheet saying, what can I do? Right? Because I don't think a lot of people really embrace or understand the idea of two things. First off, character sheets and systems absolutely do that. Absolutely tell a player, what can I do?
Sure. Even the design of it can sometimes affect that sort of thing.
Absolutely, right? But then secondarily, you have really great games that the system tells you what you do, which is like your character sheet doesn't necessarily. So like understanding that you're allowed to think outside the box, understanding that the box is there for a very particular reason, and a really excellent example. I don't want to get into like edition wars, right? However, there was a huge departure from 3rd to 4th edition. And there was a lot of people who really struggled with 4th edition because D&D, because they felt like it didn't have the flavor that other editions had. And what they hadn't realized was that the player's handbook was designed to tell you how to run combat. Mm-hmm. It was really focused entirely on this idea of a balanced combat system that a lot of people didn't read the DMG. A lot of people still don't read the DMG. Mm-hmm. And the DMG was telling you, how do you play this game outside the moves and the roles?
Right. Sure. DMG's Dungeon Master's Guide.
Yeah. So I think it understanding first off how to act outside the box, right, and know when you can run outside the box,
right.
But understand the power that systems have in this stuff.
Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate, what vast cannibal hunger.
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Discover more about the myth-punk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com.
Probably a good time to actually transition to some specific systems that do spotlight players, to give examples. I know you had at least one you wanted to talk about.
I want to really talk about first the one that's the most obvious, but a lot of people don't see it as a spotlight mechanism, which is Dungeons and Dragons. Because when you roll for initiative, you're basically rolling to who gets player spotlight.
Well, first, anyways. And then,
no, but it's ranking everything, right? Granted, you will have some.
You don't control the scene, though, is my thing. Yeah.
Sure, but you'll have certain players who are like, or certain groups that are like, all right, well, the bad guys go and then the players go, and it doesn't matter what order they go in, kind of idea. But I think a lot of people do play where whatever your role is, that's the order you go in.
That's usually how I've always done it, yeah.
And there's also a sense there that part of what you're doing is it's a tactical decision, right? Of saying, if this person goes before this person, what happens, right? What's different? And then you have rules, of course, like how do I hold my action? And there's repercussions.
Right. You guys have some homebrew rules, like where the fighters could swap their initiative order with anyone else in the party.
Right, and things like that. But, so the interesting thing here becomes, even thinking of initiative outside the scope of combat, right? Even though maybe it's dexterity based, right? But it absolutely is, this is your spotlight. This is the point in time where your character is now telling their part of the story. It's just sort of a shame that it very often is construed as just being a purely mechanical, when do I get to swing my sword, right thing. But
and also there's oftentimes a real dichotomy in D&D games between like sort of the like almost overly mechanistic, this thing and then this thing in combat versus the sort of loosey-goosey out of combat, like who's talking, who's taking an action. I don't know who talks loudest,
Yeah. And there have been times when I have kept up the initiative order and that we continued to move in that initiative order, you know? And then players get to sort of decide when they want to go after somebody.
Yep.
Right? They can't decide when they're going before somebody.
Right.
That's what the die does. But they can decide, I want to go after somebody.
Yep. Right.
Which, you know, again, I think is often, you know, like people don't think of initiative that way. I have a couple. Do you guys have any games particularly that you could think of where it talks about player spotlight?
Well, I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is one that we've both been playing together, which is Otherscape. You know, so we can talk about that for sure.
Yeah.
I guess City of Mist, is it the same way?
Yeah, City of Mist is the same way, where the system prescribes that the GM decides whose spotlight it is. So I think that becomes a very important differentiation. The system is dictating that. And I think that's important and different than our conversation of when the GM has GM caveat, because it means the GM is now focusing not on when people talk, is not focusing on who gets the spotlight the most or whatever the case is, but like in our game, I had us making certain that I was focusing on narrative elements. When is this a story? When does this tell a story other than, yes, we're watching a group of people who are wandering through a shanty town. They are clearly outside their element. And I wanted to highlight that by taking the character who is most outside their element, which is in fact Jamie's character, being kind of this cyborg. And so that becomes a definite push element in that, not so much that there are skills involved that maybe we're not good at, but also pushing players towards creating more well-rounded characters, and also Jamie's character having these moments of, how do I be human? And can I be human? And how important is this to me? Becomes way more important to me than the person who may be really good and has the gift of gab and is schmoozing their way through a bunch of transients.
Although you do want to also give characters a chance to shine too.
Absolutely. I think there should be those moments where there's dichotomy, but importantly enough to understand that in Otherscape and City of Mist, it's called the Mist Engine games, because there's another one, and I don't want to mention all three of them every time. But the Myth Engine very specifically says the GM is driving in and has some instruction on how to do that. It really does have some ideas on how to walk through these.
So my question is that in that context is are they having the GM select the players in order to enhance the story experience? And that would be my question, because I mean I feel like with that, if there's an encounter and everybody just rolls their die, well, we're more or less looking at almost like a map, like, versus if I'm the GM, then I can create a whole narrative as to why this person becomes is the first person to act, or is the first person to get engaged. So I mean, were you able to use that in one of your situations where that was really advantageous?
Well, again, this is something that Otherscape does specifically, right? They don't have a role for initiative because the GM decides who goes first, and there can be lots of times where you're doing pacing, particularly when we're talking about splitting the party and such, where you're doing pacing, where you're going back and forth to get those sort of dramatic moments, right? You have the rest of the party that's maybe doing something. You have one person like the thief who's crawling through, some sort of sewage system to get somewhere, or you're looking at a hacker who's maybe in a system who's doing their own thing, and you want to create this kind of immersive environment for them.
I think it can also push the idea that your character doesn't have to be good at the thing, and like it gives you opportunity to either like be for your character either to be to play against type or to go back more into it. Like in the example we gave of my character being thrown into this social situation, she could have tried to go out and try to talk to people, but instead she went back to her sort of like default, but in that circumstance where it was, I'm going to try to like go up to the rooftops and scope things out,
right?
You know, and like neither of those is a wrong choice, but it's a choice that determines kind of the characters. Are they trying to kind of, you know, well, this isn't my skill set, I'm going to pull back from that and try something that is, you know, and there's wrong. It's just, you know, it's just different outcomes.
Absolutely. And it just feeds story,
right?
You know, let's see. I'm trying to think of I'm trying to remember if what Chronicle of Darkness and Hunter, do they really talk about that, or is that more GM caveat?
You know, off the top of my head, I don't recall that being a specific thing that's talked about. You know, they do talk about like sort of like the importance of your character's story within the group narrative and that sort of thing, but it's more like, I don't think there's really a system behind it that
I thought that was an issue. I mean, I could be convinced, but I thought there was definitely
there's an initiative. Almost all these games have initiative systems, right?
But in a way that when I was looking at running it, I was definitely story driven.
Yeah.
For me, it was in the story that I was hoping to tell or excited to share. It was very much about a biker gang and the people within the biker gang having their challenges as they were confronting something really, really dark. And so in that particular dynamic, initiative was going to be almost based on the split character dynamic, but then what are you doing with that time as you're split away from the group and that need for the group to get back together?
And we're going to talk about GM caveat, which is what I'm going to call it. And I want to note that just because there's some sort of advice in terms of how you would do so doesn't mean it's in the system. Almost every book gives you some sense of how to GM. What that's doing is that's probably saying, look, you may not be very well versed in how to do this. Here are some ways to do it.
For sure.
That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
We are talking about games like In a Wicked Age, right? And In a Wicked Age has an interesting mechanic called an O-list. And so one of the things you're doing in the O-list is you're feeding into the narrative of like the dark time of the soul, right? You're feeding into the narrative where you lose only to get better. And it's something that In a Wicked Age does through the O-list. So you don't get on the O-list, O-W-E, as in your spotlight is owed to you. And if you're doing well, you don't get the spotlight very often. So what happens, you get all these people who are struggling in the beginning, and then as they do that, they get back on the O-list, but that character who maybe had this like triumphant moment doesn't get back onto the O-list. They don't get the spotlight until they have a shitty moment.
Wow.
Which is kind of interesting. And then when you get on the O-list, you get kind of advantage dice. So you're actually rebuilding your pools as you like push other players up the O-list, you're getting advantages. Another example is like if you're doing a troop style game, you have multiple characters on the O-list, you could cross out some of your characters to give advantage to other characters. And that when you do show up and you've had this big struggle, now you're like, it's a really great example of that is the dueling scene in The Princess Bride, right? Where we're going back and forth between Fezzik, right? And Fezzik is winning, right? But then ultimately gets knocked out, right? But you could see the Man in Black, you could see the Dread Pirate Roberts is like losing a lot, right? Until eventually there's a big win at a big moment at the end of you're like, I'm not left-handed, right?
Well, I mean, and that is a good and traditional story plot. So what comes to mind is, any type of wrestling, world wrestling, right? The heel goes out there and beats up the good guy, but right at the last minute, the good guy bounces back, and then pushes up against the heel. And who knows how it necessarily ends, because there's always another story. But yeah,
right. But those are absolutely written, right? Like that's clearly has a path. So, there's 100 games that use traditional narrative structure that we've talked about a bunch, right? But I think those are the games that probably have In a Wicked Age, Otherscape is what we're looking at, and then of course the initiative system in D&D. I think are probably the ones that come out most. Again, a lot of these games have and certainly we want to hear if you have a game that that you like that uses a very prescribed system. We'd love to hear about it.
Or for associating a scene with the character kind of thing too, like whether it's prescribing the system or not.
Have you had a scene, Jamie, where you're like, oh, you know what, where either the player captured the initiative, or have you where you're like you want to break away from the system that's in place for a narrative or to enhance the story?
Yeah, I mean. Personally, like this is definitely like a style thing. Some people like follow the rules or the system, like just that's the system, you follow it. Whereas I tend to like if something makes more sense in terms of the story, I'll switch the spotlight or whatever. A lot of times, I mean, usually I follow the same general rule that you do, where it's like if a player disagrees with it, they can roll or they can present an idea that we like better, kind of thing. So like, yeah, for me, it's like the systems that call out the players who spotlighted, like even those are still somewhat subject to GM and player interpretation somewhat. But, like I said, like most systems I look at that way, where the system is a guideline. And whenever it's a situation where the guidelines are working fine, then you don't need to play with them. But if something doesn't make sense, or for me, like immersion a lot of times can be messed up if like, not with player spotlight, but like for instance, like you're in a game where like the range of a weapon is really like all weapons have the same range, the definition close, near, far. But someone has a sniper rifle. Like it's like I'm going to on the fly change the rules a little bit to make it make more sense, because if you got a sniper rifle and either you're shooting at someone right in your face or you're shooting at someone 10 yards away, like it's different than if you're with a pistol. And like even if the rules don't define that, like there's a part of me that just wants to have that to like feel like a sort of sense of I guess immersion is the right word. It can get broken. Now, I'm not like a hardcore with that, where like you have to have 15 systems to determine the exact range. That's when it gets stupid. But
but I do agree with you. So it is about the immersion, I think, and for me, it's about the immersion. So we don't break the story, and then the other component to it is what's going to move the story along and advance it.
There is, just as a little aside, this is just a dumb tidbit of information that you made me think of system. There's a game called Phoenix Command. It actually is a system that was used for the first Alien RPG ever, and a game called Living Steel. Because when I was younger, I was very, very into very, very crunchy games. Phoenix Command actually follows the trajectory and velocity of every bullet until it stops.
Right. I think it's in a spaceship. It doesn't make sense. But.
So it's so funny because what it'll do is actually you carry it through, and armor becomes important, and armor piercing becomes important because they actually calculate the velocity of the bullet when it goes through body armor, that if it slows it down enough, but not enough for the body to slow it down, then it'll bounce off the other side of the body armor and then bounce inside the body.
Ricochet, yeah.
And it does that. You basically keep getting damaged until the bullet stops.
Oh my god.
This is a crazy system.
That's a bit much. I mean, I get it. Especially like I said, like in a spaceship, it does make sense. Like you're shooting a gun on a spaceship, there can be real problems there, right? But
and when I was gaming like that, I also was not worried about story. It was all about mechanics, and because I had all of this extra time, right? We could sit for 8 hours in our basements like playing these crazy games, like Starfleet battles.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Sure, Battletech.
Well, no,
Battletech.
Starfleet battles, you'd have a game would easily last 16 hours.
Yeah, I've had Battletech sessions that were like that. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't have
Battletech usually went that.
But they were painful. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Or how many of us really wanted a space that we could set up Risk and play it down to the last little guy?
Oh yeah.
But anyway, that's a complete
side conversation.
Yeah, it's a complete divergence. Anyway, so those are system driven, right? And I think they can be very powerful, but they're, and it's funny too that there is bad's not the right word. There is a consequence to having a system driven spotlight like that, in that some people kind of really rankle, kind of really wince under the yoke of the system, pointedly, or if you diverge. Right? If you have something like initiative where somebody's looking at that number and they're just waiting for it, and you by GM caveat are like, oh, well, you get to go do this other thing, or even sometimes like a bad guy dies before somebody's gone, you're like, it really feels weird, know? So you have to be really careful that the players are all okay with that.
Yeah, it becomes definitely like a player style thing, because you're right. I've definitely played with players who are very they depend on knowing the system and knowing that that's going to happen or isn't going to happen, and get kind of thrown off if something diverges from that. And there's other players who are the exact opposite, who feel like they're being locked in place by the system and get fixated on that. So. And
it's why we talked about this during the agency conversation. It's why I think mechanics like GM intrusions are so important, where the players get something for that. That there's a mechanic there that says the GM can take a little control away from the players to do something story-oriented or whatever the case is.
Dark dice and
but then you
Coriolis.
rewind it, right? Exactly.
Dark dice,
Dark points and Coriolis are... So one of the reasons why Coriolis is my go-to horror game is because you have this... Dark points are another thing entirely, because the players sit there and watch this pool of points gather in front of the GM. And GM's like, do you want dark points? Do you want to do this thing?
You can re-roll that die.
You can re-roll that die, Awesome.
Well, there's actually one other thing with this. It's not exactly spotlighting, but there are systems where the result of your role kind of determines who has agency in that situation, you could say who is spotlighted. Right. It's been a little while since I played Cypher, but I think Cypher kind of works that way. But it's just a matter of I've run Chronicles of Darkness this way too, or when I've used a partial success system, where it's when you have a full complete success, that's when the player has complete decision, and sort of partial success is almost like mixed agency, where the player gives one thing and the storyteller gives one thing.
Right. Yes. I use that a lot when it's not prescribed. Right. Is the idea that players get to narrate their successes, GMs get to narrate the failures, and then there's some mashup in between. Right. I think a big departure for me was, Call of Cthulhu, was one of the games that really hit that home, that if you failed your sanity roll, ostensibly you lost player agency. Right. Mm-hmm. But I sort of turned that on the ear and be like, look, not to make fun of, obviously, actual mental illness, but in a fantasy sense of madness, right?
Seeing the elder gods is a whole other category.
That's kind of the fun part of those games, right? So I wrote a game that basically said the opposite, was that when you failed that roll, you got to say how you went insane. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you commit suicide? Did you, did you run off screaming? Right? Yeah. Don't rest your head. Mm-hmm. You have the fight or flight response, where if you fail that stability roll, you don't get to, you you have to do one of those two things, but you get to decide which one you do, right?
Yeah, like 95% of my players I've run for, I would say, are great for that.
Right.
The 5% who kind of are still fixated on winning. That can be a problem.
Right.
Trying to minimize what happens with that role,
Yeah.
But that's rare, especially these days. I think when I was younger, it was a little less rare, But
I mean, I still get players who don't know about that give and take. There are a lot of times when someone rolls and I, as the GM, will turn to them and say, why did you fail? What happened? What was the misstep? And you're right. A lot of players go with that. Oh, this is fun. I get,
some of them even lean into it more than I would expect.
More than I would expect, right? But then some of them are just trying to mitigate that failure,
exactly.
And that's not really as much fun, I don't think.
Yeah, generally, no. Yeah. I mean, it's, the only, edge case would be if their character really doesn't make sense for their character to fail in that way, then maybe I'd allow a little bit of room for that. But generally speaking, I think it's better to lean into it.
There's probably some conversation about why we're playing games and this idea of I play and I tend to run deeply flawed characters. So there's more room for that kind of stuff. Almost everything we ever play, there's some sort of weakness mechanic. There's some sort of negative trait. There's some sort of...
Remember the Dust character? You had a character Dust, and I think it was just this terrible shot or something. It was just he could not do anything, and you're just So I think you ended up ordering around everybody else,
and just trying to feed into that. But a great example of that was the first Wonder Woman movie, where Ewan Brenner's character was a sharpshooter who turns out just never killed anybody, and just has the will for the fight and wants to support his friends, but just isn't a killer, and you wouldn't expect that in a sniper, Right?
Yeah, I do like characters like that.
Anyway, so do we want to talk about then player driven, where the players get to decide when they have spotlight?
Sure.
There are a good number of games. Burning Wheel is a good example of one. We're used to a very, what we in our agency conversation talked about, proactive versus reactive players.
Right.
We're very used to a reactive game, and a lot of RPGs talk about the what do you do moment. Right? It's a pretty fucking common trope.
Sure. And it's I think I might have mentioned that thing. I don't see it as a good and bad. It's kind of good or bad in a certain situation, whether it's reactive or not. What do you do is a fine prompt to have in certain situation.
But then we have games that are very specifically player driven. So by and large, site-based adventures can often be player-driven. That's kind of one of the big advantages, is that while your plot may have a set of rails, that this is what's going to happen in this, the players have this illusionism of, well, I'm going to walk down this hallway instead of this hallway.
It has a sense of an open world.
It has a sense of an open world, right? But games that have goals, games that Burning Wheel has a belief system that really the players get to decide what's going on.
How does Burning Wheel arbitrate player actions like that, spotlighting?
I mean, by and large, it really is the sometimes the players can scene set. So let's actually look at Burning Empires.
Okay.
Burning Empires actually has a scene economy in it, which is really interesting because every player gets to have one scene. And they get to determine what kind of scene it is. Is it an interstitial? Is it an interstitial scene? Is it a conflict scene? What kind of conflict scene is it? Right? And you're actually setting it up because conflict scenes are your ability to change the story disposition. I do this stuff all the time. So in Burning Empires, you have a story disposition. Ostensibly, what you're trying to do is say, we're as a group, as a story, trying to do this this overarching, or the good guy's going to win, the bad guy's going to win, and what that is.
Tell us about Burning Empires. Like, give us a little context for Burning Empires.
Sure. So Burning Empires is the second big game in the Burning Wheel, genre. The Burning Wheel headquarters, Luke Crane is the lead designer there. And Burning Wheel was sort of his baby. Burning Empires was a really great artist and a graphic novelist named Chris Moeller. Has this set of graphic novels called Iron Empires. Really, really well done. Obviously, very talented artist. And so they got together and created this. Chris has his own stuff, which is great. And so not taking anything away from him, but the worlds and the system and the setup become very Dune-like in terms of, if you think about what the aesthetic is and such like that.
Burning Empire's the scale a little larger. It's more like kind of like, not just like the character going around, but it's also like the scale of the empire they're running or in?
No, not really. They're not that. It is very focused, but what they are, one of the things is they have these worms, and this is like one of the main plot points. These worms can take over. And so very often the story you're telling is about the subjugation of a planet by this alien species. And they take over people in high ranking areas. And they do have a section in the beginning where you pick a planet and you determine what level, where you are in it. And the whole game has you have phases of the invasion. So you're really just talking about the invasion. It's really amazing. And so really what you're doing in the disposition of each phase is how successful have these aliens been in infiltrating this society, right? And based on, just to talk about, we're going to talk about this much, much more later on, just give you a sense. Disposition basically is this story mechanic, right? That says, all right, we have these pools of points, and when those pools of points go down to 0, right, then you have lost. But how much that pool of points of your opponent has gone down determine how much compromise exists. We use this very significantly in Torchbearer and Mouseguard as well in all of their conflicts. And so your conflict scenes, the reason you want to get a conflict scene is because you think you have enough dice and enough power to be able to have a scene, a gunfight, a big dramatic conversation where you can put successes towards lowering your opponent's disposition, right? Sometimes you don't want conflict scenes because you don't think you have enough. So you want scenes that get you equipment, that get you followers, that do other things to give you more dice for conflict scenes. So it's a game where you can probably tell I'm very excited about it because it's a game that to me, if somebody who loves to engage with system, and it just tells an amazing story by engaging with that system, and which is sort of like a hallmark of most of Luke's games, right?
Yeah, I do like that where you're calling scenes out, but also like what type of scene it is on top of it is useful guidance, I think.
And it's not for everybody. I'll be honest. Like one of my players, after we played a full phase of Burning Empires, was like, I kind of feel like I would have gotten the same experience from playing Primetime Adventures, you know, which is a lot looser. You have a little bit of like setup there. You're playing out a story arc, but it's not so prescribed as choosing scene by scene by scene, you know.
Right.
But that tension to me is really, really fun and interesting. But the important thing is that the players are they drive those scenes. They drive what comes next. Now, granted, the system says everybody gets one, right? There's certain points where, you know, obviously in A Wicked Age, the system dictates, but the players are being able, by choosing to take those advantage dice, are basically de-emphasizing them going first, right? So the players are in control of that a little bit. I'm trying to think. So there's, you know, we're so used to GMs framing scenes. There are a lot of games that have like ideas of kickers and bangs. And kickers and bangs are ways that players are saying, this is what I want my scene situation to be. So Dictionary of Moo we talked about has, I forget which one it uses, but it's basically saying my first scene is going to be this. This is what my first scene is. This is a situation I want to be put in, you know?
Yeah, and that. I imagine that'd be really useful for like a problem that can happen in a lot of D&D games where characters will have these elaborate backstories, and sometimes they can be just over elaborate anyways. But we're like, it actually could be interesting, but it never really comes up in the sessions because the DM have their own kind of like direction for things, and the player might try to introduce it, but they don't want to hog the spotlight. It's really, I think, it'd be useful to have that much control of the scene where you can say, hey, let's do a scene that draws on this element in my backstory that you might not know about. You know? Kind of thing.
You know, the big problem, of course, with player-driven stuff is unless the system dictates it already, you can get players that really just keep going. Right? And that's part of the problem. You don't want one player to take the spotlight. It is a big problem in what do you do scenarios. Unless the GM takes very strict reins, some players can just run away with it, you know? And
imagine, especially in a situation where people playing don't know each other that well, and that sort of thing. Like usually when I'm playing with friends, it's like you have this sort of tacit, just, I don't know, like it's not discussed because you've known each other for 20 years or whatever, you know, and like it just kind of flows.
There is an important idea that I bring to every game that I tell all of my tables, that your goal, so in case it's not clear, I prefer games that tell the players and the GMs what their roles are very explicitly, right? I'm not into these squishy rule sets that are like, you're all telling a story and you go around the table and you know, and that's fine for some people. It's just not what I prefer. I want to know exactly what I need to do and when I get to do it, right? Because I am a more gregarious player, because I have ideas on ideas on ideas, and I want to run at them, right? So it's important to rein me in. I need rules to rein me in, you know? But the thing that I tell players, your role, more than anything else, is to make other players look awesome. That's how I want every player to play, to make everyone else look awesome. Whenever you're playing, I want someone to think, before I do something, how is this making other players look awesome? You know? Now, that doesn't mean that they can't have their moments of shy, but if everybody is trying to make everybody else look cool, then they're less worried about winning. They're less worried about taking the spotlight. They're less, you know, they're less worried about their losses and want to see their friends succeed.
It also, probably in the game world, so to speak, not the meta world, but in the game world, it also probably means as a team they're organically thinking more cohesively than their individual roles, which is probably helpful from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I usually think about it less about like them making other characters seem cool and about them trying to help what the group is trying to do. But it winds up kind of being the same thing.
Yeah, I think yours is perfectly geared towards teenagers who, because you end up having that one who wants to stand up and show you every single move he's going to do, and then there's two that are back there that like little quiet people, not wanting to.
And keep in mind also the big difference here is that I run a lot of convention games.
Right.
Or
yeah.
used to.
And I kind of like avoid them. Like
that becomes a very different mindset, right?
What's the primary difference between running a convention game and a game around the kitchen table?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about it a lot, is that how well you know the people that you're talking about, what kind of vibe.
Right. And it's not even about like necessarily whether you're friends with them or not, but just the things you know about them as a person, kind of factor into like kind of the stuff you don't have to say, like, or, at least not, you don't have to focus on as much.
Right.
Which isn't to say you shouldn't have a session 0 or you shouldn't talk about those things, but it's like, when you're playing with complete strangers around a table at a convention, it's like you could have any number of possible combinations of personalities and what people want to get out of the game and that sort of thing. So
I also I have a lot more setup for convention games. You're dealing with varying different experience levels, right? Secondly, lines and veils or any sort of safety tools are critical. We were able to sort of shortchange that because I know a lot of people at the table for our regular games. But I think nowadays I couldn't even imagine running a convention RPG and not talking about safety tools. But the part of knowing your players is understanding what players are going to bring what to the table and how much can you trust them to want to go in a direction. Right? If you have a game where they know what they want to do, that's awesome. But it's also, you have to be careful that they're not themselves sort of like railroading you and the rest of the group.
Or at the very least, you want to try to match that railroading up with the style and of the game and what story you're trying to tell. Because if someone is like really driven to play a certain way that's not mesh with the theme that you're all trying to create, the story you're trying to create, that creates a tension that's not a good tension versus the good times.
It's an interesting experience I've had that highlights this. Did you guys ever have like maybe, look, as GMs, we're always trying to create some kind of mood, right? We're generally, not all GMs, but most of us want there's to be some sort of tension, want to create some sort of atmosphere. You're going through the effort of knowing what smells are in the air and all that sort of hippy-dippy horseshit, right? Do you ever have those players who are like, all right, I go to the next door, I kick it in. I go to the next door, I kick it in, When
I was younger, it was definitely more common than these days, but I have experienced it,
sometimes, look, I won't lie. I mean, not every game is for me. And I've been listening to a lot of podcasts, a lot of actual plays. And it's one of the things that's driven me to want to do this podcast is that those people are having fun.
Right.
And that's wonderful. But the sheer number of podcasts I've watched where they're just blathering at each other and not getting anything done. When I post to some forums, particularly like Burning Wheel or Otherscape or whatever, I'm always like, oh, how many tests do you guys get in? And when I tell them that my group gets in for Torchbearer gets in 12 to 15 tests per session, their minds are blown. They're like, I never get in that. Like, I actually try to get in entire dungeons in a sitting. And they're like, no, my players basically get to like 3 rooms. We actually ran once. I wasn't running. Somebody else was running Temple of Elemental Evil. And it was like this 3-room a night thing. And I was like looking, I don't know if you guys know how big Temple of Elemental Evil is, but there's at least 50 rooms.
Yeah.
I don't have the patience to do that. So that's sometimes when I get into that mode, when I'm like, I have enough hit points, hell with this. I kick the door and go. What's in this room? We do this. Great. I go to the next
Get
room.
frustrated with it.
Get really frustrated.
Yeah, I have two modes with that, where it's like, if I'm playing where the focus is on the narrative and stuff, like I think I'm the same way, where I want to keep it moving. But if I'm playing with people in person, and it's kind of like, this is the game where it's almost more like you're playing cards. It's the game is the thing you're doing while you're hanging out with friends, and like then it's not like, then I'll play like a tabletop 5e game where like combat takes 12 hours because like it's not, like I'm not just trying to get the story out of it. It's like that's the thing we're doing while we're chatting and having drinks and stuff.
If we're chatting, yeah.
So there's kind of two different modes. But if I'm focusing on it being an RPG and like that's what we're doing, then like that's can be a frustration with 5e as a system, anyways. Just that like the combat can take so long.
And it's also not even just that. It's also a lot of these podcasts. Again, I'm not pissing on anybody's fun whatsoever, right? But there's a lot of like very high production value but everybody's trying to throw out these like one-liners. Everybody's trying to have these funny zingers, right? And they're so focused on, I listened to so many Blades in the Dark actual plays where they were so focused on their character being funny and interesting that I'm like, I'm not really very interested in the story going on.
It's fine. My Blade's character was like a creep, so it's like it was funny, but not in that way.
So pacing, you definitely have to worry about pacing, right? Yeah. If the players are really, if everybody's in charge, it depends on GMs too. It's like, or how focused your game is. Yeah. I'm sure for some players would be very frustrated by my games because they're just like, driving force,
Yeah, mine are kitchen table games, generally speaking. I don't particularly do all the online stuff. So in those, when I'm running them, I want the story to unfold. So I'm trying to move the story as far as I can. So I do think that sometimes I may get hit with a little bit of the railroading, but I think most of the time people are pretty satisfied because, the story gets told and we avoid that frustration.
And, we talked about it before. That's all about buy-in, right? If everybody's sitting at the table and okay with that, then that's what we're here to tell your story. And that's, as long as everybody understands it, that's cool,
There's one other thing I wanted to mention about player spotlight. So I think it's pretty clear, like, calling the player spotlight, who the player is. But you brought up this thing, a good point, which is like, there isn't often as much of a clarification about when the scene ends. And I've even like with systems I've been playing with, like trying to wrestle with that, where it's like there are obviously situations where it's very clear this scene ended and this new one started, but there's other times where one thing turns into another, and it's like, well, we're chasing this guy down the hallway. Is that a different scene now? That sort of thing. And like, can you think of any systems that kind of like help with that, or because usually I just make a decision ultimately, there
is a lot of
fade to black. There
is a lot of GM caveat to a lot of that stuff. Yes and no. There are a good number of systems that basically are like, a scene is this, right? If we're going to talk about scening, clearly defines what is part of a scene and what happens. To some degree, Otherscape does that. Right? It's a very clear delineation of the GM sets the scene, picks a player for the spotlight, that player says what they're going to do, makes a roll, and then there's consequences. Right. By and large, that's a scene. Like, that's at least not only like the roll, but that's a situation that's happening. Right. Now you're going on to another character spotlight where you're going through the same process. Right? And so what that means is that the other characters during that scene are support mechanisms. Right? And they can be foils, or they can be, and I've done this a number of times. I ran a tarot-based Artesia game because Mark Smiley in Artesia, and the Artesia game is not a story game. It's It's filled with amazing lore and stuff like that, but it's a pretty traditional, it's the fusion system and such. But I created a variation where you do 7 scenes, again, towards this disposition idea, where the players are actually, the characters are at odds with each other, and who wins each scene determines at the end of these two sort of teams, right, whose story succeeds or fails based on each. So there's 7 characters, and each character gets a scene, and the turn of the card dictates a lot of stuff, right? And then I describe it, what happens in this scene. Right. And then when everything's rolled, there's maybe a little denouement, and then we move on to the next scene, I feel like that role for me becomes a big part of it. Now, there's a lot of systems that everybody's doing things, right? And it's not scene-based,
right. Even though it gets called as a scene. I mean, I guess Chronicles of Darkness would be an example where they have scene as one of the time demarcations, and there are some situations where it's clearly like this is a cutting point with other scenes, but there are a lot of roles that will happen in a scene and a lot of actions, and it becomes like a question of where you want to cut it or consider it part of a different scene. It's not as much of a factor with that, but with systems where you have a certain pool of things that you can deplete in a given scene, it becomes more of an issue, more of a question. It's like, I get my pool back if it's a new scene, so is
yes.
it,
yes. And I think, like you said, I think Cypher does a little bit of that, where, because you could take certain actions, that replenish your pools, later on. I think a big part of that ends up being, like, especially for some of us who are writers, we've kind of studied and pulled apart both literary and film, and I really do run my games like a show. So so I'm thinking like a director. I'm thinking, when does this open up? What do we see? What do we experience? How does it play out? Where is the dramatic moment? I want a dramatic moment that this ends.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's this pause. And there are some games, I quite honestly can't think of them off the top of my head, but there are some games that really do talk about that, and how I generally try to drive most of my scenes.
I don't want to go too far down that GM side because we're talking about the player side, but one of the things I recently started doing is watching older films, Humphrey Bogart and Bette Davis and some of those. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how to encourage better dialogue among players. How to get them to be more comfortable, having that conversation across the table, limiting maybe some of the action till really critical moments rather than necessarily pulling out the gun, as we're all apt to do.
Yeah, it can be challenging.
But one of the beauties of those films and this age is trying to get that conversation going.
And so that was what basically interstitial scenes were in Burning Empires, is this opportunity for players to convey information to each other. Those are really great points where somebody's like, I need to tell so-and-so and catch them up to what's going on, right? And so, all right, what does that look like? And then the player's like, well, we're in this hall and I see them and we're really worried about some of the other people. So we're going to mix and mingle until eventually we meet in the middle and, and I ask them to dance, right? And now we're going to have this conversation, cheek to cheek in the middle of a ballroom, right?
That's a great scene.
And try and that's where that conversation can go back and forth, and a player can really be driven. And I try to make certain I have scenes like that. My first scene in my current D&D campaign, the very first scene is where they've met, but they're coming having already explored parts of this temple complex. And didn't like maybe fought, maybe had some kind of conflict, but that's not important. They learned something.
Right.
So now they're learning each other,
Right.
and they know that they have some information. Now, how do we convey that information?
Right, and giving them the lore to share to each other is a great way to make the lore more in the game and not just something that's on a piece of paper that you as a player know, but it never really comes up in the session.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, a nice little device there. That's a really great device, by the way, because I think one of the things you can do is without the characters, without the players knowing it, they may have vital information that, but for the fact that they think to share it, may lead them on a bit of a wild goose chase until they do share it or
Right.
GM. And that could be a really fun way, and it's way better than just meeting at a tavern.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because we, I think, sometimes find the opposite problem. I think a lot of groups find the opposite problem of how do you shut your players up? So many games that I've played or run or seen, that's all they do is just want to sit and talk in character, particularly plan. Right.
I mean, I'm okay with a certain amount of that, but I like it to be like half the session, not all of it.
Well, I think that's why a scene economy becomes important.
Yeah.
Is put it into the context of a scene.
Right.
What's the conflict here? What's going on? What do we need to do? How do we need to feel? Sometimes, like thinking outside the box in terms of conflict, right? Okay. What's at stake here? Well, we're going to convey information, but in the meantime, is one of the characters losing their nerve? We talked about we don't have a reluctant hero moment in enough RPGs.
I agree with that.
Right? And this is a way to bring that. Maybe your character is going to quit. Maybe your character doesn't want to do this anymore. Maybe your character doesn't want to be king. Maybe your character does not, but the player does. The player wants to participate. However, maybe what's at stake is your character's losing its nerve. And then another scene down the line is trying to bring them back. How do we bring Thor back after he's sitting, drinking beer, playing with his buddies?
Right, exactly. At the very least, giving them that motivation in their dialogue keeps it from kind of just sort of going around and around and talking in character, but it's not going anywhere.
Well, actually, what I find is that I have lots of players that want to talk outside of character and plan every detail outside of character. And I'm like, no, you have to stay in the character.
I when I was younger, I used to be very like, you have to be in character, that sort of thing, and talk in character first person. I've become much more about like, you can totally say my character says this general thing.
Sure.
Partially because like a lot of times the difference between character and player can be so great. Like if you have a character who's very glib and the player is kind of has a hard time with speaking out loud and articulating things.
Absolutely.
So.
But I don't have a problem with them referring to the character not in first person, or my character is going to do X, Y, Z, or my character's trying to say so and so. What I have is well, what are you going to do?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what is every step, and how do you create this fucking ironclad, turtling?
Yeah.
And I'm like,
I have some players who love doing that, and it's always a toss up between, because like that's part of what they want to get out of it. So I want to just say, don't do that.
Right.
But trying to limit it, that's like something.
I just try to remind them it's a story.
Right.
So try to stay.
That's why I like blades, right? And I love looking at blades. It's how I've run games for a long time, but and thinking of like Ocean's 11, right? They get in, they're here, you're learning who the characters are. You don't know what their plot is. You don't know the things that they've done and planned until it gets revealed. In a flashback. And I'm like, I'm down with that, kind of idea. We were, in terms of like conversations and in-character conversations, just before this, we were talking about Puppet Land. Where you have these points, these very specific points in Puppet Land by John Tynes, by the way, where you have this intense 30-minute, you're in character, that's all you're doing.
It's crazy.
Kind of idea, which we totally should try.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to give a shot, for sure. So yeah, I think we covered the topic pretty well. Obviously, as is our way, we'll circle back to everything we've talked about here in different forms. And
maybe at some point in time we should collate some of the best GMing advice in RPGs as another episode.
That's a good idea.
Interesting. Okay.
I have to say I really support that idea. I want to give a shout out to the Aliens. I think it's by Free League. They have a great GM side, and they really dive into how to tell a good horror story, and I just thought that was exceptionally well written.
Cool.
You have been listening to the Modern Mythology Podcast. Visit our website modernmythology.net for more episodes, articles on our blog ranging from gaming to media theory, links to our other podcasts, and more. Also check out James's ongoing mythic RPG and transmedia project The Fallen Cycle at fallencycle.com.